Hey everybody, welcome to P&T Knitwear, and a conversation that promises to be unbelievably fascinating with as few buzzwords and knowable things and more focus. Let me just start by saying two important things. The SustainableMedia.Center, which is your host today, is focused specifically on Gen Z and their love of social media and the current state of well-being and mental health that they're suffering under. And we'll talk a little about that. A huge thank you to Bradley Tusk, who's our board member and is the owner of this fabulous bookstore. And so with that, we're going to begin with these two gentlemen. I'm not going to make the mistake of assuming that you both read their bios. But I will just tell you very, very quickly. Garry and I have known each other for a couple of years. This is his new book, Taming Silicon Valley, and it was released yesterday?
Day before yesterday.
Day before yesterday. How can we ensure that AI works for us, which is what we're going to talk about today. Garry is Professor Emeritus from NYU, a well-known observer and critic, is that right? Is that too strong?
I'm a critic of generative AI who loves AI in general. I'm often labeled a critic of AI, and that's not really fair because I want AI to work better.
And that's because most of the people writing about it don't know the difference, but we're going to get to it today. Raffi Krikorian has a fabulous track record in AI, was the CTO at both Uber and
I ran the self-driving car team at Uber, and then I was the head of infrastructure of the back end of Twitter worldwide.
And the CTO of the DNC for
That's also true.
For a beat, and is now at the Emerson Collective. So we're going to do this as a conversation. We're going to ask some questions and then kind of let it roll free, and then we're going to make sure we have some time for you guys to ask questions as well. And we have a microphone in the audience. So I want to begin by aligning both of your perspectives with this organization and talk about Gen Z. So when you look on the horizon line and you look at the direction we're going in and you look at AI's role in society, what do you think the world looks like that young people are going to be living in 10 or 15 years? And what can they do to affect that trajectory? I'll start with you, Garry.
I'll tell you the single scariest study I read recently. A lot of people are worried about robots are going to take over the world, the Terminator and all this kind of stuff. I'm not that frightened by that. But there's a study just a week or two ago with Elizabeth Loftus, who Barbara Tversky would certainly know, showing that large language models could implant false memories in people. There was some earlier work that made that hardly surprising, but it's kind of scary to see it. So that means that people who run the large language models have enormous power to manipulate us. Whether they choose to or not is, of course, an open question. But at the moment, there's nothing to regulate them, to stop them from doing it. So I could easily see a society in 10 or 15 years, I'll combine that with my second biggest worry, which is that OpenAI, I think, is going to become, out of financial necessity, a surveillance company. The things that they presented to the world last year are not particularly profitable. In the meantime, they're trying to hoover up everybody's private data, their calendars, their email, and they just bought a share in a webcam company, and they put on their board Paul Nakasone from the NSA. I see the writing on the wall. And so 15 years, we may have a world where a lot of our views are influenced by companies that run these things, don't tell us anything about their data, how they're doing it, and kind of like what social media did, but worse, what algorithmic control of social media, but even worse, influencing our lives and our beliefs. I think everybody should be concerned about that.
So before we jump over to Raffi's answer, so presuming that that's all correct, and you're 14 years old, 15 years old today, what do? You're too young to vote. Like 15, 16, let's move up to 20. What are the actions young people can take if that's...
Well, if you're old enough to vote, then obviously that's one thing that you should take very seriously. I rushed this book out. I wrote it in 2 months, like without a whole lot of sleep, because I wanted it to be out before the election. Sorry, I'm coughing, folks. I wanted to be out for election because I knew nobody was going to talk about this. Everybody's talking about tariffs and things like that, and they're important. But the AI policy that the people that are elected in the next cycle make is, or maybe they don't make any policy at all, that's going to be pretty bad too. Whatever they do is going to influence us for years. And so, even 14-year-olds could be making videos trying to sway public opinion to care about all of this. Older people can vote, they can maybe boycott things. So one of the things I talk about at the end of the book, let's consider intellectual property. If you're an artist or a writer, you're getting ripped off right now. You could, even if you're not an artist or a writer, you could say, I don't want other people to be ripped off, or maybe that'll be me later. I won't use these generative AI programs until they get their house in order, until they fairly source the data that they're using. And look at the effects of the environment. So if you care about climate change, what about these massive models, and they're going to make them 1,000 times bigger in the vain hope of making them better? So people could be worried about the climate costs, the intellectual property now that's being stolen, and say, I'm just going to say no until you get your house in order. You don't have to be 18 to do that.
Raffi?
I mean, I don't disagree with very much anything Garry said. I mean, I think if we just look at it from the perspective of these kids, they live in an environment right now where it's hard to tell the difference between, I'm going to test out a metaphor for a second, hard to tell the difference between sort of like clean water and sewage, because it's all coming through in the same pipe, like right at them, in a lot of ways.
That's really appetizing.
I know, but
I thought my metaphors were dark.
But I think that's the situation that we sort of live in. And I think that like what Garry's saying is true on the generative AI front, of just like they're just being bombarded with this type of information, but their entire media ecosystem, just look at the bigger picture, is sort of like this mixture of clean water and sewage, and trying to like sort it out for them. It's not unsurprising that they're bummed out, that they're confused, like that they're getting into silos, that they're figuring out all these things, because they're also trying to navigate this meta picture that we sort of live in. And so, you know, I'm an optimist at heart. And so like, I actually believe in these young kids to actually try to lead us out of this world. We might need to give them a few tools in order to pull it off. And I think that for the people who are not over 18, you know, there are amazing activists in the world, like Sneha Revenur is one of them, like in Code Justice. I remember speaking to her specifically about it, and she talks about like, we were the first generation, we can debate whether it's true, who has been raised by AI in a lot of ways. But she's been organizing all these young kids to start telling their stories, to start telling what the world looks like to them through their lens. And I think it's really important to start lifting up what those things look like. And we need to help them imagine what's the world we want to be in, so we can actually start building it, or help them build that world. So, you know, I think left to their own devices, I think we might be in a pretty bleak place, but I'm optimistic that we can help lead out of it.
So let me take a swing at your analogy. If the water companies were profit-based, and you had a choice between sending your customers water or sugar water, and the costs were relatively similar, but people consumed a lot more of it when you sweetened it. Like the water companies currently don't make money on your consumption, or margin their public service. So, but once you add profit into the mix, and I think this is a place where both of you guys have done interesting writing on this, once you take these systems that have a societal impact, and you add profit as a motivator, it seems like ethics take a backseat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very curious. I'm very curious Garry's opinion on this. Like, I used to be in the commercial sector, so I used to do this all day long. And I'm going to go with, there are bad people in the commercial sector, but not all people in the commercial sector are bad. But the incentives are super strong to behave in a particular way, because there's a single metric you're optimizing for. You're actually optimizing for that bottom line in a lot of engagement, which you're a proxy for that bottom line, how that bottom line should move. And look, I've even tried to start a bunch of different discussion-based companies and things like that. And you know, we always come down to we need to help them with their information consumption mix. Like, what's the right diet you want to give people? Like, you're right, feeding broccoli is really hard. Broccoli is really good for you. I mean, I really like broccoli, but like feeding broccoli is a hard thing to do, especially when candy is right there. And so like changing those downs is really, really hard.
There's a chapter in the new book called the Moral Decline of Silicon Valley. And I agree with what Raffi said. There are good people in the Valley, and there are bad people in the Valley. And I think that profits, and especially perceived profits, around large language models have changed the balance. Grifters have come in, grifters who were in crypto have come in, and there's been enormous change since ChatGPT itself became popular. So Microsoft, for example, really positioned itself as a responsible AI company, partly in response to doing something irresponsible, but that they corrected quickly. Excuse me. In 2016, they released this thing called Microsoft Tay, which some people might remember. And after 12 hours, it started spouting Nazi slogans. It looked a little like X does today. Oh, can you take that off the record?
Yeah.
No, you can leave it in. So it looked really quite horrible after 12 hours, and they took it down. And Brad Smith, who's the president, wrote this book about responsible AI. They really leaned into it. They still have lots of stuff on their website about it. Then they fired a lot of the people who were doing it. When did they do that? Not long after ChatGPT came out. So Microsoft has a stake in OpenAI. It's a complicated stake. We could talk about the finances of it, but they have a stake in OpenAI. And when they saw how popular ChatGPT was, they privileged access to the software, they really changed how they were treating things. And a nice contrast is when Sydney came out, that was built on OpenAI software, and Kevin Roose had this crazy conversation that he wrote about in the New York Times, where the software told him to get a divorce and said it was in love with him. And this time, instead of taking it down like Tay, they just put some Band-Aids on it. And then they rushed it out anyway. And at the same time, they told the CEO, Satya Nadella, said that he wanted to make Google dance, and he did. And he got Google to change its tune. Google had the same technology as OpenAI, basically, and in fact, a lot of it was developed at Google. But they didn't release it because they knew it wasn't reliable. Excuse me. They knew it wasn't reliable, and they were like, we'll just wait until it works. Blake Lemoine, the guy who thought that that Google's AI was sentient, was actually there working on these systems, trying to make them reliable or to kind of red team them. So Google was doing a lot of red teaming, not releasing stuff. Overnight, the culture changed. When ChatGPT became popular, became a household word, everybody wanted to have a piece of it, and that changed the ethics really radically.
So let's talk about ethics for a minute. Where does ethics fit into companies? I mean, both of you guys have had runs in the commercial sector. Like, is ethics was it part of a conversation? Was it oh yeah, we'll put ethics in the corner over there? And how is that changing in terms of AI, for better or for worse?
I mean, I feel like I just answered that. It's always been there, but it's being buried in the corner right now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to disagree. I think it's correct. I mean, in fact, like I've had even stories of if you have ethics on your resume, you sort of get downvoted as part of the hiring process. So like I understand where that's coming from, but also like I think like we're just in like a weirdly complicated zone. So I think that this is a generative AI versus other forms of AI kind of conversation. Like when I used to run self-driving cars, like we would think a lot about sort of like how a car should make decisions on the road. What are the right choices it should make? Like we've run surveys on like outcomes of the trolley problem, things like that. But like we're now operating in the world of like people's brains and words on a screen and things like that. And it's getting a little more complicated for people to wrap their heads around how they should make good decisions. Not saying this is a good place to be, but I think like we've left the realm of the physical world and we've moved into the world of like our brains, and it's getting hard.
So let's talk about ethics in driverless cars for a minute. So, and I'm not in this space, but I observe it from afar. So right now, lots of people die in automobiles every day. The numbers are catastrophic and have been for a very long time. Seatbelts help that somewhat, but people die in cars. If you're at a driverless car company, the number of people that you can afford to die on a daily basis is 0. Because the media will pick it up, they will report it, they'll say, person died in Tesla, blah, 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 whatever. That's not going to happen. 0 is an unlikely number. And if you try and make the PR argument that we've reduced deaths
got better than
80%, some huge number, some magnificent number, that will still not.
And it's complicated for lots of reasons. Yes, PR is part of the problem, but it's also the distribution of those deaths. like if you just get actually down to statistics of it. Like I've had this argument with lawmakers. Some lawmakers who try to make a point that, to your point, that it's just a matter of getting to less deaths, and therefore we should be able to release this technology to the road. But if we get to 80% of the deaths instead of 100% of the deaths, the question then becomes how did it choose what those 20% look like? If those 20% were all women, that would be really bad. We get into all these other nuanced arguments. So I understand how you get to that place. I'm of the opinion that we need to be better than humans, but perfection is hard. But there's a PR issue. There's all these other questions that need to be solved.
I'll just add one brief thing. The only thing saving the driverless car industry is that they've actually rolled it out relatively slowly, right? If the driverless car industry took the software that they have right now, rolled it out universally, which they could do, it'd be just flipping a switch, basically. I mean, you have to have the right hardware in the right places, but effectively you could do it. There would be a lot of accidents, and there would be so much pushback that the industry would die overnight. And so actually the industry there has been wise in being relatively slow, doing it city by city. We could talk about Tesla separately, but I don't consider it to be a genuinely driverless car anyway. But we could talk about that. But the fact that they rolled it out slowly has limited the deaths. I think someday driverless cars will in fact be much safer than people. They're not now. They're limited in the territories they can drive in, and bringing on board a new city is difficult. There are all kinds of technical problems right now, but eventually they will be safer. And I will actually be campaigning then, saying, hey, we can save lives if we do this, because people will view it irrationally. In general, I try to argue against the irrational view. The irrational view right now is that generative AI is just like artificial general intelligence. It's like a few days away, and that's an irrational view, and I will argue against it. But we will have a time where driverless cars are safer, and I'll be arguing for it.
So let's talk about social media for a second, and in particular, most of the people who know you because you have a legendary ongoing argument with another high-profile AI voice in the space. And I debated whether or not there was a reason to say his name, and I can't think of a reason not to because it's all public. So you and Jan LeCun go back and forth.
No longer, but go on with your question, and then I'll explain.
All right. In order to have your opinions break through the algorithm, not the AI, the algorithm broadly, being in a public fight is one of the easiest ways to kind of ratchet up the algorithm because it sees dispute and anger and pushback. First of all, how did it happen? Secondly, I didn't know it was over, although I guess I maybe noticed it had settled down a little bit. And is there an actual dispute? I mean, if he were here today, would you and he? Oh,
such complicated questions.
Yeah.
So once upon a time, LeCun and I were civil to one another. Barbara was at a debate that we did in 2017 at NYU. There was a very civil and interesting debate. And then in 2018, I actually wrote a paper at the end of 2017, but I published it around the 2nd of January of 2018. It was called Deep Learning, A Critical Appraisal. And of course, LeCun is well known for his work on deep learning. And Eric Brynjolfsson, the economist, said, this is a really interesting paper. And LeCun immediately shot back. He said, but mostly wrong. Now, if you go back and look at what's in that paper, that's a little problematic for him to have said that, in as much as the things that I said were true of deep learning are certainly true of large language models. There's a little intellectual corner that we could talk about, but I said that they were greedy in terms of the data, that they didn't reason very well, that they were conceptually shallow, they generalized poorly, et cetera, et cetera. But our war started then. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is large language models came on the scene. I said, you know those things I said about deep learning? They're still true for this new popular version. And he said, Garry, you're fighting a rearguard action. I think I have that memorized. And so he was still totally opposed to me and kept fighting with me. And then part three is Galactica came out. And that was one of his chatbots. And Galactica got panned widely because it tried to write science. And it said all kinds of nonsense, like you could get it to write an essay about the benefits of eating crushed glass. And so Meta, primarily driven by him, presumably, took it down. He was super bitter. But then ChatGPT came out. And it ate his lunch, right? It was the same model, basically. But it became wildly popular, and his was gone. And so LeCun had to do the one thing that he would never have wanted to do, and he still hasn't acknowledged that he did it. But he changed his position to mine. So there's nothing to argue about anymore. Because once ChatGPT came out, he suddenly said, well, large language models suck. That's a verbatim quote from one of his recent talks. He said that they're greedy with respect to data, they're never gonna work, they don't reason very well. Like, you go back and you compare his talks with my 2018 paper, and they're almost identical. So there's nothing to argue about anymore. Then there's one last little thing, which is he called me a grifter. I don't know why. And I blocked him on Twitter for a minute, and I thought maybe I shouldn't. And he blocked me, and he's blocked me ever since. So now sometimes he pops up and attacks me on LinkedIn or something like that, but it never gets the same. He's a funny man. True story, never been told.
When we talk about government, let's talk for a moment about the US government, which has begun to get some policies. And then I also want to talk about foreign governments and whether or not there are examples in other places around the world that we should be paying attention to in terms of, I swore I wasn't going to use this word today, guardrails.
Guardrails can actually mean many different things.
Indeed. That's why I wasn't going to use it, but I talked myself into a corner. Let's just start with.
We'll get you out of the first part.
Let's start with the Biden administration's position around AI.
The Biden administration did great work. They have an executive order. It's really very good, but it's bounded in principle. So most of what it does is to request for information, a lot of different kinds of information, to monitor what's going on, and it's much better than not. But in this country, and I live in Canada now, but I'm a US citizen, have lived here most of my life. In this country, we have this division of labor. So the executive branch does not write law. And so they were not able to write laws that would say, for example, here'd be one of my favorite laws. You can't release something to 100 million people unless you test first or somehow make some case like you would for medicine that the benefits outweigh the risks. Seems like a reasonable thing if you're going to release to 100 million people. And maybe the Biden administration might have wanted to put something in there. There'd be lobbyists and so forth, but maybe they want to put it, but they can't. They're just not allowed to. That would require an act of Congress. Now, as you know, I spoke in front of Congress at the first of these AI meetings about a year and a half ago. And everybody in the room seemed to think that was a good idea. I also talked about how we should have a national AI agency, and everybody in the room, bipartisan, seemed to think that was a good idea. But nothing has actually happened, right? None of the things that we talked about then has actually been turned into law. I wouldn't put that on the Biden administration. I would put that on Congress.
Easy to solve that.
I'll just add one other thing. Obviously not easy, and we could talk about why. One place we should look to is the EU. They now have an AI Act and Digital Services Act and so forth. We'll see how it all works out. But I'll give you one example from today. Everybody hates GDPR, but there was something from the FTC today. Everybody hates GDPR because you press these buttons on the cookies and it's super annoying. But it does other things that are good. So there was something today, FTC was looking at how your information gets used by a bunch of companies like Meta and Twitter and so forth, and how teenagers' information gets used and so forth. And the zinger at the end is kind of like, none of this has to be this way. In the EU, they don't invade your privacy that way. So like, our privacy is invaded left, right, and center because we don't have any kind of privacy law, even after years of discussing it, and the EU actually has a privacy law. So the EU AI Act, it's going to have some problems, it's going to have some glitches that are going to be as annoying as the cookie thing probably, but it's also going to do some real good. And it is a real model, and we should be watching it closely and seeing how it goes. And certainly if we don't put something in place of our own, the rest of the world is going to turn to the EU, as they have around data privacy. And so the US is going to lose its chance to show leadership in this by default, by doing nothing.
I mean, the Biden administration actually did like the quintessential American thing, which is instead of building legislation, they use the government's purchasing power. Like that's fundamentally it. Of just like, the federal government will not purchase anything from any large language company, AI company, etc., unless you can meet the following guidelines. And since the governmental sector is so huge, it kind of forces everyone into a place. This is not the right long-term solution, but it's laudable that that was the approach that they could take given the constraints that they're operating within. But the other thing that we should be thinking about, not just like guardrails could mean one of two things. Guardrails could either mean shit mitigation, like we're going to box it in a lot of ways, or it could mean like actually stay on this path and you can go really fast. This is actually the prevents you from going off the side, but just optimize your path that way, and we can go really fast down that road. And the thing that we don't think about, that we should be thinking more of, is just like, how do we not only put risk mitigation in place, but how do we give incentives to actually move very quickly down a particular road? So the EO kind of does that. Just like a lot of money could be right here for you if you stay within these bounds. I would love to see something like that show up in the legislative world too.
I'll just add one other thing to complicate the term, which is in the field, guardrail means something that you stick on a large language model to make it not do something terrible. Like you have guardrails so it won't explain how to build a nuclear weapon or how to make a bioweapon or something like that. The empirical observation is they don't really work. They're kind of like not even deadbolt locks, but those easy ones that anybody can open with a credit card. They keep the honest people out, but they don't do much of anything to keep the dishonest people out because we have what's called jailbreaking techniques, and nobody has a good way to stop those.
So let's talk for a minute about AI and social good. So
Social good, do you say?
social good. I mean, both of you guys see a lot of new startup ideas, right? Presumably lots of things cross your desk with people saying, I'm doing this work in AI that I think could really be good for, fill in the blank, this community or this problem. Are there things you're seeing that make you go, oh, wait, there's light at the end of the tunnel? That, it could either be the name of a company that you're comfortable sharing or just a concept. But I'm just curious about positive outcomes for AI.
I mean, I'm going to sidestep it slightly, and for a reason, which is I think there's many, many companies trying to do positive things with AI right now, but in many cases the AI is not actually up to what they want. We've seen this in other domains, like the humane pin, right? It's a reasonably clever idea, but the AI wasn't there, and so everybody laughed at it when it came out. There are people talking about, I'm going to use AI as a tutor. That's a brilliant product. The problem is the AI isn't really smart enough to do it yet. It's sort of good enough to make an approximation of any product that you'd want, but not good enough to do it reliably. If you're a student and you discover that your teacher is hallucinating, you're going to check out. And so I think it's actually premature for a lot of the things that we've started to imagine. I think ChatGPT set the bar impossibly high. 4 years ago, if you were working on an education startup, you would have had a much more modest goal. Now everybody's shooting for the stars, but the tech isn't quite there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say exactly the same thing. I spent a lot of time in the social sector. So aside from working with people like Khan Academy, et cetera, we spend time in the immigration space, we spend time in the climate space, and everyone wants to use generative AI. The number of people who've shown me a chatbot for immigration legal services, for example, is innumerable. I've seen many of them at this point. Lots of questions of why there are so many and not working together, I applaud all of them dreaming about what we want this to look like and how we want it to work. They're all trying to live in a world where we can make this more efficient, we can make this more effective. Imagine if you can get access to information. It just doesn't work well yet. It's not good enough for I wouldn't release it to a bunch of lawyers working on the border, for example. It's easy to step around it.
Look what happened when New York City had that advice line.
Exactly, that's a great example.
Go ahead. I assume we don't know the story.
Oh, I mean, I don't live here anymore, so I kind of secondhand. But they had a chatbot, and it told people things that were actually illegal, that didn't work, etc. I think did it die a quick death, or now I think they're trying to make a second version of it.
Yeah, it didn't die as quick as death as it should have.
The first version, I think, was widely mocked because it wasn't actually reliable.
So again, if we take generative AI out of the picture, there are lots of people who are doing amazing work using, let's call it traditional AI for a second, doing traditional AI, whether it be data science or others. There's amazing work going in the social sector on that front. It's the generative AI stuff that might just not be ready.
Yeah, let me amplify that. So generative AI is just a subset of AI. Right now it's getting 98% of the funding and 98% of the mind share. But your GPS system in your car that navigates, that's AI. It works perfectly fine. We don't need to have any mitigation of major failures the way we do something that's going to create misinformation or going to be covertly racist in housing decisions. It just drives it doesn't even drive your car. It just gives you navigation point A to point B, and that stuff is fine. Google search, mostly fine. It's when you build these chatbots that promise the moon and can't really deliver the moon that you get into trouble. Because, for example, they'll give you a biography, and the biography says, I own a pet chicken named Henrietta, this really happened. And it's just made up. And it can be something much worse, like there was a lawyer who was accused of sexual harassment, and it was just made up. Or you can use these things to make job decisions, and they're covertly racist, according to a Nature paper that just came out, and shouldn't really surprise anyone. So the problem is generative AI, these chatbots mostly, have many downside risks. They're also stealing intellectual property and so forth. They're just in a different category, but the things that people talk about. Data science is still great stuff. Like, nobody is sitting here arguing against data science. And it also turns out that most of the time when people want to do AI, they're actually hindered because they haven't done good data science. So the AI can't be any better than the data unless we have a much more sophisticated version of AI than anybody knows how to make. And so people pour in this, very poorly coded data and so forth, and then the AI doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're in this like weird spot right now where like people are confusing statistically stringing words together to mean cognition, and like people just don't seem to understand that. Like, it's a hard thing because like we anthropomorphize a rock, and now the rock is talking to me. So like I get that. My one hilarious thing about the GPS situation, yes, truly AI. But like there was a time when Google Maps was being rolled out that people would literally drive themselves into lakes.
I remember. I mean, even there, it took some work.
It took some work. Like, people have to get used to it. But this one might be moving. Generative AI might be moving too fast. Like, people's ability to catch up might not be. We might not be able to catch up.
So I want to talk about a particular pain point. So you tweeted about it the other day, or X'd it. Can I say that? X'd it?
Z'd it? You can just call it tweet.
All right. So you talked about an excellent experience you had with Booking.com, Hotel.com, and the fact that it just couldn't seem to get right anything about what you were trying to, the hotel. The other day I bought tickets on Ticketmaster and had an equally horrible experience with a human, and desperately wanted a robot to be able to just solve I want this seat for this amount of money, to send me the ticket. And so there is a lot of pain right now around really bad phone tree garbage. And so let's talk about AI and work. AI, it does seem like there's a whole bunch of jobs, some of which are blue collar and some of which are super white collar jobs. In the law, when you're doing the same, piece of paper 1,000 times. Isn't its failings notwithstanding, isn't there going to be a real impact on the future of work that's like in the near future?
There's already been some. I think, the hardest hit are voiceover actors are just done. There's not going to be any voiceover work for human actors unless they're like George Clooney and you know their name and recognize their voice. Visual artists who do like concept art, not like really creative stuff, but, and I'm not talking about fine artists that are inventing something new, they're in deep trouble. On the other hand, interestingly enough, since 2012, a lot of people thought that taxi drivers and truck drivers were out of work, and so far they're not. You can actually take a Waymo in San Francisco and so forth, but I don't think that's, the numbers of them are so small, and they're actually like humans behind the scenes, whatever. That has not affected that job market at all. So sometimes we get it right. Another famously wrong one was Jeff Hinton, who's one of the pioneers of deep learning, famously said that we might as well stop training radiologists. That was in 2016. He thought by like 2021 we wouldn't need them anymore. We actually have a shortage of radiologists. There are like 500 radiology startup companies, and not one radiologist has ever been replaced because they do more than just look at pictures. The systems can look at the pictures, but they don't really understand the records.
So the idea that the robots are coming to take our jobs, you think, is a fallacy?
I think is what?
A fallacy.
I mean, in the long term, they are. I mean, in 100 years, I don't know what humans are going to do for work, but in the short term, it does depend on the profession. Customer service agents, a lot of them are bad, and some of them might get replaced. The good ones, the AI is nowhere near. Yeah. Like, I had a trauma with renewing my insurance remotely in Canada. I talked to like 4 agents, and they were terrible. They couldn't, I wanted to do it from the road. It was late. We don't need to go into all the details. And then the 5th person was like, where have you been all my life? She was so good, right? Like, she's not going to be replaced by an AI anytime, not in my lifetime, certainly.
Yeah, no, by the way, here's why I'm sure you're wrong about that. Because the people that are making that decision don't know her name or her employee number. They're going to make a decision about a category of employees.
There is the like Hotels.com side of it, right? I mean, there are going to be some companies that just say that, I don't care. I'm giving you the lighter version of that expression, which Hotels.com seem to viewed. And Consumer Note, I posted on Twitter, and then they got in touch with me and sorted it all out. But
So future of work?
I mean, maybe I'll say a counter for a second. Like, there are places where there are opportunities, right? Like, I think like there is evidence that some of these systems could help lower skilled people, or like level up a little bit. Like, what, not for replacement purposes, but sort of like this notion of like democratizing access. Like, yes, like coders are this interesting example, but lots more people can now write shitty code, but you know, it kind of compiles, kind of works, memory's free, RAM's free kind of thing. And so like, I think there's like, there are opportunities there.
There's maintenance and security.
Sure, but there's also opportunities for automated code scanning, for all these other things that can show up. But there are also situations like, let's take the call center, for example, like work from MIT of doing like emotional sensing. Like we could actually be reprioritizing the queue when people come into the call center, like, and not burn people out. Imagine a world where like our poor call center operator has like 5 really angry customers in a row. We could talk about whether the company's shitty at that point, but like 5 really angry customers in a row. It impacts his or her mental health. We could be reprioritizing and distributing that load across the call center in different ways. And I think there are opportunities here, but yeah, I mean, it's not all rosy. I'm just finding the 1 or 2.
So what's interesting is I expected at least one of you to, the reason why I question 100 years as being the peg we have to worry about is that's a long time. Like that's far enough out that I can say, okay, not my problem.
Well, historically, funny you should say that. Historically, people have always promised that AI would be 20 years away.
Yeah.
And that was partly an evasion of responsibility. Before there was like big corporate funding, all the money was like government funding and so forth. So if you promised it was 20 years away, you got, your next 4 grants paid for, and what happens, happens.
So I have a friend that runs a law firm, and what he says to me is the problem is the entry-level work, which is pretty dreary, but which is how you build culture and you get to know people and they get to know partners. Like that's all being shifted off to AI, which means there's now no entry-level position. They can't figure out how to bring young, inexperienced lawyers into the law firm and into the culture because they don't need them anymore. And I'm like, yeah, I don't have an answer for that. That's a good question.
I think that's a real issue.
Yeah, and I worry about this actually in the software engineering field all the time. Like if we don't need junior engineers anymore, what happens when the workforce rotates? Who's going to train the next generation of engineers? Like software engineering is purely an art. It's not really a science. Like it's like a mentorship and all these apprenticeship in order to pull it off. If we don't have people to do that because we didn't train one generation, we're going to have real issues.
I want to get to audience questions, but
Can I insert a word before we go on? Because this always making me think of it. It's not my word, it's Cory Doctorow's word, but I do mention it in the book, I think. Enshittification, right? There are a bunch of things that are getting enshittified. Like the quality of the data on the internet is getting enshittified because now you have search engines trained on the output of large language models that hallucinate. And this is a version of enshittification of society. If we got the training path for so many people, and then we don't have the best talent anymore.
I'm trying to get a tiny couple $100 medical bill paid. And the number of different people that touch that invoice at my healthcare company, the number of different vendors that can't agree and their databases don't talk to each other, and it's shocking. And I think strategically they want me to give up and go, you know what, it's $235, screw it. But that can't be a strategy. All right, let's talk. I'd be remiss, given the 2 guys we have on the stage, if we didn't talk for a minute about AI and politics. Because it's a red hot topic, and there's been all of this fear and danger around fake news and AI fakes. As best as I can tell, it hasn't quite happened in that way.
In the U.S., at least. Like I think it has happened in other places. Like Indonesia's elections was basically Disneyland for deepfakes, as far as you can tell. India had a whole set of similar issues. In the U.S., we have this interesting thing going on. Yes, there was like a Biden deepfake in New Hampshire during the primaries. But we might not need AI, frankly, to be really worried about disinformation and all the craziness. Like I think like we have enough humans doing it in the U.S. elections that like.
And we already have Elon putting out deepfakes.
I didn't want to say a name, but my friend here did.
So broadly, AI and politics.
Well, when you wound up with that, I didn't quite know where you're going to go, and I was almost going to say it's too little, right? So it's obvious that we have a misinformation problem. It's obviously going to get worse, but nobody in the election campaign is really talking about AI policy at all. Sure. In the debate, the Harris-Trump debate, she mentioned AI once. He didn't mention it at all. Nobody is talking about what's going to happen to society if we have a completely unregulated AI, which we might wind up with in the United States, and which we have. Yeah, there's some existing laws FTC can use and so forth. But we may have a largely unregulated AI, just like we have a largely unregulated social media. And largely unregulated social media has been a disaster. And so people should be talking about AI in the context of the elections way more than they are.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, like, the Harris campaign, I'll put my politics aside for a second, the Harris campaign hasn't said very much about what their plans are. The Trump campaign has. And like they've talked a lot about industry-led panels in order to do a bunch of guidance around AI and emerging technologies. And I view that as problematic. I mean, I think like we need like three-legged stools in order to pull this off properly. Like we need to be talking about the commercial entities, we need to talk about government regulators, and we need to be talking about civil society, like all of us. And like right now, the balance is completely skewed to the commercial entities and incentive models, et cetera. There's no counterbalance. Like regulators aren't educated enough, and we're just not speaking loudly enough in the grand scheme of things. And then if we just accelerate this with industry-led panels, I don't know how we're going to wind ourselves out of it in the grand scheme of things.
I completely agree with that. The only thing I'll say is that the Biden-Harris administration has still been in the two legs rather than three legs camp. It has not called enough on civil society. So I think we shouldn't be confident either way that this election turns out. I think I'm concerned about Trump's capriciousness above and beyond all else, and so I have much more personal confidence that the Harris administration would sort this all out. But the Harris administration, should that come to pass, has to have that three-legged stool, has to bring in civil society more. It's not enough to have photo opportunities with Sam Altman in the Oval Office. That's not going to cut it.
Yeah, and it's a hard, like maybe I'll defend it perhaps, like it's a hard thing to do, like, but they need to go do it. Like this is the thing they need to go do. Like you saw this in the EU Act negotiations. Like everyone was kind of on the same page until the last minute when the French were just like, oh wait, we have a really big company in France now, and we need to be on their side too. So like I'm sympathetic, but not enough. Like we still need to get our acts together and actually figure this out.
Sometimes I say my worst nightmare is no regulation of AI in the US. But my second worst fear is pure regulatory capture. That is actually the default here, is that the big companies will set the rules to keep the small companies out and keep them from having to do anything real. That's the path we're on. We have to get off that path.
Can I ask you I was going to say dictator for a day, but I really don't. If you were president for a day, like what's the thing you would do?
With respect to AI
regulation.
The top two things I would do, but I mean this book gives 11. The top two that I would do.
One day is one thing.
One day I would set up a US AI agency, and I would empower them or charge them with having pre-deployment testing where you have to show that the benefits outweigh the cost for anything that's going to be widely deployed.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions. How are we going to do this? I'm not going to climb up there, so
You need one of those beach ball things. That you can
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, thanks for this. Well, I kind of want to go back to more where the conversation started. I'm David Berkowitz, and I also run a community for marketers in AI, but I want to talk more about my role being the father of a 10-year-old. And so when we talk about parental responsibility, like I love, I want to encourage intellectual curiosity, right? I want my daughter to be ahead of the curve, and she has access to some of the latest information out there, and not to do her schoolwork, but for things like she loves cooking, so we create recipes using AI, right? And just come up with more ideas, more ways to explore the city thanks to AI inspiration. But yet, it's are there safe ways to parent in this age of AI? Is the advice to get for parents to get their teens and tweens and off AI entirely, or are there okay ways to do this? What should the parents' role be now?
I mean, the advice that I've given the college teachers, I think, applies in some ways, which is let them use it, but let them understand the limits of it. And I think that advice will be true even as AI gets better or changes or whatever. So I actually suggested this a bunch of times, and then somebody wrote a tweet that was the best publicity I ever got. They said, I used the Marcus method, they said in this tweet, and I had my students look for hallucinations in their papers. And the reason the tweet went viral is he said something like, and all 63 of the students used ChatGPT, and all of them found hallucinations in the paper. That was a real learning experience for them.
I mean, the thing I've always wanted to do, like, you don't have to answer every question, but the thing I've always wanted to do is, like, we need to reboot home economics. Like, we need to, like, change home economics to no longer be what you and I all took, but, like, we need to be talking about digital literacy. We need to talk about all these things. The thing I do with my kids is I let them use ChatGPT, but I'm there with them. So we can have a conversation about it. Like, that's the thing that, like, honestly, it gives me really good, like, father-son time, which is also a lot of fun. But, like, I think that's the thing. It's just, like, we need to, like, just be engaged in these things and not just be passive about them all.
So, my name is Israel Mirsky, speaking as someone who is both a founder of a company that's attempting to use AI for responsible purposes. In the context of the regulation discussion, and how much regulation is too much, how much regulation is too little, how do you think about China, who are going to have very few regulations on how much and what content is ingested and what models are trained, and both the threats and how we think about our relative level of regulation in that context?
So I don't fully accept your premise, strangely enough. And I say that as someone who's not overall a fan of Chinese policies. They actually have AI regulation and we don't. I think that they care about having a stable society. They don't want all of their citizens to be ripped off by cybercrime and things like that. And so they've actually put some policy in place. They put one thing that I find fully unacceptable, which is, that might have interesting side effects. They have required their public-facing large language models to toe the party line, which I think, I would never want any government to be bound in that way. So I don't agree with everything that they want to do, but they're actually more progressive, or I'm not sure the right word, more active in making AI regulation than we are. Today was announced the working paper from the final working paper from the UN AI Advisory Board, and China was fully a part of that, and as far as I could tell, reasonably cooperative and so forth. So I don't fully accept the premise. I think there are lots of concerns there. One concern I actually have is whether we should be fully open sourcing everything, because that's giving it to China on a silver platter. Back to our friend Jan LeCun, I saw him give this interview, and he said, he's a very arrogant man, I'm only recognized on the streets in 2 cities in the world. I listened to the rest of the clip. One of them is Paris. Of course, he's from Paris. Of course, they know him there. And the other is Shanghai. And I'm thinking, you're famous in Shanghai because you're giving all of the tools to Shanghai, empowering the entire nation of China. Is that really what we want? I'm not sure that we do.
Hi, my name is Serena, and I'm invite you along. My question is, how do you keep updated with all the AI changes? I feel like it's like day by day.
It's impossible. You can, follow people on social media and so forth that you trust. You can read my Substack. I try to, pick out the best stuff, GarryMarcus.substack.com. But there's just no way. There's so much happening. I think if you take a step back, there's less happening than it appears. So you have influencers, right? AI influencers is a profession now. You have AI influencers every day write thing on Twitter. The most amazing things happened in the last 7 days, and here they are. And they always say there's exponential progress. And then if you add up all of that exponential progress they've been promising over the last 2 years, we should have artificial general intelligence by now. So I think people overpromise. They see every new result and they think, oh, this is tantamount to something amazing, and it isn't all. So there's some sense in which we're maybe driving ourselves crazy trying to keep up with a lot of stuff that doesn't actually pan out. But there's certainly news, constant news, and there's no magic solution there.
Gentlemen, thank you. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Amazing conversation.